My name is Marcus Brennan, and I need to tell you about the person I used to be. Not because I'm proud of it, but because someone needs to hear that even the worst of us can be reached. Even someone like me, who spent years making it his personal mission to torment Catholics on every corner of the internet, could be completely transformed. And it all started with a dead Italian teenager I'd never heard of. I wasn't always like this. I grew up in a nominally Christian household in suburban Ohio, the kind where you go to church on Christmas and Easter, say grace before Thanksgiving dinner, and that's about it. My parents were good people, decent people, the kind who volunteered at the food bank once a year and donated to charity. They weren't hypocrites exactly, just not particularly invested. Church was more of a social obligation than a spiritual practice, something you did because that's what suburban families did, not because you believed God was actually present or interested in your daily life. My dad worked in insurance sales. My mom was a dental hygienist. They worked hard, paid their bills, gave me and my sister everything we needed. Religion just wasn't a big part of our lives. We had a Bible somewhere on a shelf, probably covered in dust. We said grace before big holiday meals, more out of tradition than conviction. When I asked questions about God as a kid, the kind of questions every child asks, my parents would give vague answers about being a good person and following the golden rule. Nothing wrong with that advice, but it wasn't exactly inspiring devotion. By the time I hit high school, I'd stopped going to church altogether. Nobody pushed back. My parents seemed almost relieved they didn't have to get up early on Sundays anymore. My sister had quit years before. We became one of those families that called themselves Christian on census forms, but lived completely secular lives. And honestly, I was fine with that. Church had always seemed boring anyway. Old hymns, uncomfortable pews, sermons that never seemed relevant to anything happening in my actual life. High school was typical suburban American experience. I was decent at academics, terrible at sports, spent most of my time in the computer lab learning to code. I had a small group of friends, mostly other nerdy kids. We played video games, watched sci-fi movies, argued about tech and politics. Religion rarely came up, and when it did, we mostly agreed it was outdated, something previous generations needed, but we'd evolved past. College was where everything changed. I went to Ohio State University, chose computer science as my major because I was good with computers and the job prospects were solid. Nothing particularly ambitious about it. I just wanted a decent job after graduation, maybe work for a tech company, make good money, live a comfortable life. But freshman year, I met Derek. He lived down the hall in my dorm, was also a CS major, and he was the first genuine atheist I'd ever met. Not just someone who didn't go to church, but someone who had thought deeply about religion and concluded it was all false. He had arguments, evidence, philosophical frameworks. He could explain exactly why belief in God was irrational, why religion had caused most of history's suffering, why science had made faith obsolete. I was fascinated. Here was someone who'd taken the vague disinterest I felt toward religion and turned it into a coherent worldview. He introduced me to his friend group, a collection of philosophy majors, science students, and fellow CS guys who all shared this aggressive skepticism toward anything supernatural. We'd stay up late in dorm rooms, drinking cheap beer, debating theology and metaphysics and the nature of reality. We read Dawkins and Hitchens like they were scripture, quoted them in arguments, felt intellectually superior to anyone who believed in something beyond the material world. We watched YouTube debates between atheists and Christians, cheering when the atheist landed a good point, mocking when the Christian stumbled. We joined online forums dedicated to debunking religion, learned all the best arguments against Christianity, practiced dismantling apologetic claims. It felt like I'd found my tribe. For the first time in my life, I had a complete worldview that made sense, that felt rigorous and evidence-based. Religion was superstition. Faith was belief without evidence. The Bible was a collection of ancient myths. Prayer was talking to yourself. Heaven and hell were fairy tales invented to control people. Once you saw through the illusion, you couldn't unsee it. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about that kind of aggressive atheism. It's exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, constant conflict, constant proof that you're smarter than everyone else. You can't just not believe, you have to actively dismantle everyone else's belief. You can't just be indifferent to religion. You have to see it as dangerous, as something that needs to be fought. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being about truth and started being about winning, about domination, about making believers feel as stupid as we thought they were. I remember the exact moment when it shifted for me. It was sophomore year, late at night in Derek's apartment. We were scrolling through Facebook, and he found a post from someone we'd gone to high school with, a girl named Rachel, who'd become really religious in college. She'd posted something heartfelt about how God had helped her through her father's cancer diagnosis, how prayer was sustaining her family, how grateful she was for her faith community. Derek showed it to the group, and we all laughed. Not gentle laughter, but cruel mockery. We crafted the perfect response, not attacking her directly, but asking innocent questions designed to undermine her faith. Questions about why God would allow cancer in the first place if he loved her father. Questions about prayer studies showing no statistically significant results. Questions about how many children died of cancer every day while she thanked God for answering her prayers. We weren't trying to help her think critically. We were trying to hurt her. And when she responded with obvious pain in her words, trying to explain her faith while clearly upset, we laughed more. Derek screenshot the exchange and posted it in our group chat with atheist friends from other schools. Destroying theists, he called it. I remember feeling proud of that exchange. Proud that we'd won. Proud that we'd exposed the weakness of her position. But there was something else too, something I didn't want to acknowledge. A little voice asking why it felt so good to hurt someone who was already hurting. I pushed that voice away. This was important work. Someone had to stand up against the indoctrination, the superstition, the mind control. We were warriors for reason, defenders of rationality, liberators of minds. If we had to be harsh, if we had to break a few eggs to make an omelet, so be it. I graduated with decent grades and a tech job at a startup in Columbus. The work was fine. Web development, nothing revolutionary, but it paid well and I could work remotely a few days a week. I got my own apartment, a decent car, all the markers of young adult success. My parents were proud. I was financially independent at 23, had a good career ahead of me, seemed to have it all together, but I was empty. Profoundly, deeply empty. The work didn't fulfill me. It was just coding, fixing bugs, attending meetings. My social life consisted mostly of online interactions with the atheist community I'd found in college. I'd come home to my apartment, order takeout from whatever delivery app, and spend hours on my computer. Not working, just scrolling, arguing, engaging. And that's when I found my true calling, or what I thought was my calling. Dismantling religious arguments on the internet. I started small. YouTube comments under Christian videos. Someone would post a testimony about how Jesus changed their life, and I'd be there in the comments with my clinical dissection of why their emotional experience didn't constitute evidence for God's existence. Reddit threads on religious subreddits where I'd lurk, waiting for someone to make a claim I could refute. Twitter debates about theology where I'd swoop in with my carefully crafted arguments designed to make the other person look foolish. I got pretty good at it. Really good. I could spot weak arguments from a mile away, knew exactly which questions would trip up casual believers, had a whole arsenal of gotcha moments ready to deploy. I knew the Bible well enough to quote it back at Christians, knew enough science to invoke it as my ultimate authority, knew enough philosophy to sound educated, while remaining completely closed to any conclusion that might lead toward God. The dopamine hit was real. Every time someone couldn't answer my questions, every time I got upvotes from fellow atheists, every time a believer got frustrated and stopped responding, it felt like victory. It felt like I was doing something important. It felt like I mattered. But then I discovered Catholics, and everything intensified. There was something about Catholics that got under my skin more than other Christians. Maybe it was the hierarchy, this idea that some humans had special authority to interpret God's will. Maybe it was the rituals, all the standing and kneeling and repetitive prayers that seemed like empty formalism. Maybe it was the claims to ancient authority, this notion that because their institution was old, it was right. Maybe it was just that they seemed so certain about things I found ridiculous. Transubstantiation, papal infallibility, praying to saints, Mary as the Mother of God. Or maybe, if I'm honest, it was the scandals. The abuse crisis gave me endless ammunition. How could anyone still be Catholic after everything that had been revealed? How could they trust an institution that had protected predators? How could they claim moral authority while covering up evil? These were good arguments, legitimate criticisms, but I didn't wield them to pursue justice or protect victims. I wielded them as weapons to hurt and humiliate ordinary Catholics who had nothing to do with those crimes but who bore the shame of association. I developed a special hatred for Catholicism, It became my focus, my obsession. I created accounts specifically for targeting Catholic spaces online. Multiple accounts, actually, with different personas. One that played the concerned ex-Catholic asking difficult questions. One that was openly hostile. One that pretended to be considering conversion while actually undermining from within. I'd join Catholic Facebook groups under fake names, spend weeks building credibility, then systematically tear apart everything they believed. I'd lurk in Catholic subreddits like r Catholicism and r Catholic memes, waiting for someone to post about a personal struggle or prayer request, then swoop in with my, well, actually, none of this is real, right? I'd find Catholic YouTube channels with small followings, priests giving homilies, lay people sharing testimonies, young people talking about their faith, and flood their comments with walls of text about why their faith was built on lies. I became sophisticated about it. I learned Catholic terminology so I could sound educated. I read apologetics so I knew exactly what arguments they'd make and how to counter them. I studied church history so I could bring up every scandal, every mistake, every dark moment. I memorized Bible verses that seemed to contradict Catholic teaching and deployed them strategically. My favorite targets were the genuine ones, the people who were clearly struggling but trying to hold on to faith, young people questioning but not yet ready to leave, converts who were excited about their new faith. These were the ones where I could do the most damage. A well-placed comment, a carefully worded question, a bit of doubt inserted at just the right moment, I could watch in real time as I undermined someone's faith journey. I told myself I was helping people, that I was freeing them from delusion, that someone had to stand up against the indoctrination, the superstition, the mind control. I told myself I was on the right side of history, fighting against an institution that had caused immeasurable harm. I told myself that if I hurt feelings, if I caused people pain, it was worth it for the greater good of leading them to truth. The truth was simpler and uglier. I enjoyed hurting them. There's a particular satisfaction in finding someone's deepest belief, the thing they organize their entire life around, and methodically destroying it in front of an audience. It made me feel powerful, smart, superior. Every angry response, every defensive argument, every person who told me I was going to hell, it all fed something dark inside me. It was validation, proof that I was getting to them, that my words had power, that I mattered in some way. I was addicted to it, genuinely addicted. I'd wake up and immediately check my phone to see what responses I'd gotten overnight. I'd be at work and sneak moments to check comment threads. I'd lie in bed scrolling through arguments I'd started, savoring the ones where I'd clearly won, plotting how to improve my approach on the ones where the other person had held their ground. I had my regular targets. There was Margaret, a middle-aged woman who ran a Catholic mom blog about raising faithful children in a secular world. She posted earnest content about teaching kids to pray, celebrating feast days, finding God in daily family life. And I was there in her comments every single post, questioning everything, challenging her parenting choices, asking how she knew she wasn't indoctrinating her children, pointing out how religion damages young minds. She always responded with patient kindness, which only made me attack harder. Her gentleness enraged me because it made me feel like the bully I was. There was Father Tom, an elderly priest who'd started a small YouTube channel making videos about the saints. He'd tell their stories with such obvious love and enthusiasm, this sweet old man who genuinely believed these dead people were alive in God and could help us. I'd leave paragraphs under every video about how it was all mythology, how praying to saints was idolatry, how he was wasting his life perpetuating ancient superstitions. He never responded to me directly, but sometimes he'd pin a comment from another viewer thanking him for the videos and saying how much they meant to them. I think he was trying to show me that my negativity couldn't stop him from spreading what he saw as good news. But I just saw it as him ignoring valid criticism because he couldn't answer it. There was a college campus ministry group at a university in Michigan whose Instagram I'd raid regularly. They'd post photos from their events, students praying together, serving the poor, attending mass, wholesome content that should have been harmless, but I couldn't let it be. I'd comment on every post with my atheist talking points, tag my atheist friends to pile on, turn their comment sections into battlegrounds. Some of their followers would try to engage with me charitably, inviting me to ask genuine questions, offering to pray for me. But I wasn't there for dialogue. I was there to disrupt, to discourage, to destroy. My friends from university loved it. We had a group chat, about 15 guys from college and a few others we'd met online, where we'd share screenshots of our victories. We'd laugh at the stupid theists, compete to see who could get the most reactions, celebrate when someone left faith. We had running jokes, nicknamed for certain types of believers, a shared language of mockery. It was camaraderie built on cruelty, friendship forged through shared contempt. They were NPCs to us, non-player characters, video game terminology for the background people who aren't real players. That's how we saw believers, as less conscious, less intelligent, less real than we were. We were the players who knew the game was fake. They were just programmed responses, simulations of people, not worthy of the same ethical consideration we'd extend to fellow rational beings. Looking back, I realize how deeply dehumanizing that perspective was. How it allowed us to cause real pain to real people while feeling no guilt. If they weren't fully human in the way we were, if they were just running on programming rather than genuine thought, then hurting them didn't really count. It was like being mean to a chatbot. Technically, you're saying cruel things, but there's no one really there to hurt. Except there was. There were real people behind every screen name. Real human beings with hopes and fears and struggles and faith that mattered to them. Margaret was a real mother trying her best to raise good children. Father Tom was a real elderly man who'd given his life to serving God and others. Those college students were real young people trying to find meaning and community. And I was causing them real suffering for my own entertainment. But I couldn't see that then. Or wouldn't see it. Because seeing it would mean admitting what I was doing was wrong, and I'd built my entire identity around being the one who was right, the one who saw clearly, the one who wasn't deceived like all those poor religious folks. I'm not sure when it started to change. Maybe it was gradual, so slow I didn't notice at first. Maybe there were signs I ignored because I didn't want to see them, didn't want to question the one thing that gave me purpose and identity. One night stands out in memory. I was lying in bed at 1 a.m. scrolling through my phone, reading through a thread where I'd absolutely demolished some Catholic guy's argument about the resurrection. He'd tried to argue for the historical reliability of the gospel accounts, and I'd methodically torn apart every point he'd made. Cited scholars, pointed out contradictions, explained how legend and theology had corrupted any historical kernel of truth. By the end, he'd stopped responding, and other atheists in the thread were congratulating me on the takedown. I was reading through it again, savoring my victory, when something shifted. I realized I wasn't happy. At all. I was lying in bed alone at 1 a.m., rereading arguments with strangers on the internet, and I felt empty. Not satisfied, not fulfilled, not proud, just empty. I had no real relationships. I had online friends, sure, but when was the last time I'd had a genuine conversation with someone in person? I had my job, but I felt nothing for it beyond the paycheck. I had my crusade against religion, but what was it actually accomplishing? Had I freed anyone? Had I made the world better? Or had I just spread misery and called it enlightenment? I pushed the thought away. Told myself I was just tired, that this was important work, that someone had to do it. Went to sleep and woke up the next day ready to do it all again. But that moment of clarity, that brief glimpse of my own emptiness, had planted a seed, a tiny crack in the armor of certainty I'd built around myself. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday in March 2024. Nothing special about the day. Spring was beginning to show in Columbus. Trees budding, temperatures rising into the 50s, people emerging from winter hibernation. I'd just gotten home from work around 6, eaten some microwaved leftover pasta while watching YouTube videos about nothing, and settled into my gaming chair for my nightly rounds of internet warfare. I was browsing through Catholic Twitter. Yes, there's a whole Catholic corner of Twitter, now called X, and I knew it intimately. I followed dozens of Catholic accounts not because I agreed with them, but because they provided an endless stream of content to attack. Priests sharing their homilies, lay people posting inspirational quotes, Catholic news sites covering church events. It was a target-rich environment. That's when I saw it. A tweet from some Catholic influencer with a picture of a teenage boy in a red polo shirt and khakis, smiling at the camera with this completely genuine, unself-conscious joy. He had dark hair, a friendly face, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. He looked maybe 16 or 17, standing in what looked like Italy based on the architecture in the background. The caption read, "Blessed Carlo Acutis died at 15 and is now being considered for sainthood." He used his tech skills to spread the faith and said, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. Pray for his intercession." My first reaction was predictable. I rolled my eyes and started typing a response. Another dead teenager being turned into propaganda. Another example of how the church manipulates emotion for recruitment. Another case of taking a normal kid who probably just went along with whatever his parents taught him and turning him into a saint after he couldn't object. I was going to write something cutting about how using a kid's death to promote religion was exploitative, how every culture creates heroes from their dead, how there was nothing special about a teenager dying young and being remembered fondly. My fingers were on the keyboard, sarcasm locked and loaded, but I stopped. Something about the photo held me. The kid looked normal. Not like the stained glass saints with their halos and beatific expressions, not like the severe portraits of medieval mystics, not like the paintings of ancient martyrs facing lions. He looked like someone who could have been in my computer science classes. Regular clothes, regular haircut, regular teenage boy. He could have been anyone from the 2000s. He could have been me at that age if I'd been Italian and religious. And they were claiming he was on track to be a saint? I didn't tweet my sarcastic response. Instead, I clicked through to learn more. Not out of genuine interest, I was still in attack mode, but to gather ammunition. Surely there was some dirt here, some angle I could use. Probably another case of religious parents forcing their faith on a kid. Probably nothing remarkable once you looked past the emotional manipulation. I found article after article about Carlo Acutis. Wikipedia, Catholic News Agency, Vatican News, even mainstream outlets like The Guardian and BBC. The kid was everywhere, and he died almost 20 years ago. Why was I just hearing about him now? The basic facts were these. Carlo Acutis was born in London in 1991 to Italian parents, grew up in Milan, died in 2006 of leukemia, was beatified in 2020. The Catholic Church had apparently been investigating his life for sainthood, found him to live a life of heroic virtue, attributed miracles to his intercession. He was the first millennial to be beatified, the Church's attempt at a saint for the digital age. My immediate response was cynicism, because that's always my immediate response. Of course the Church would love this kid. He was perfect propaganda. Young, good-looking, died tragically, apparently loved the Church. Of course they were fast-tracking him to sainthood. Of course they were using him to try to appeal to young people who were leaving religion in droves. But then I started reading about what he actually did, and I couldn't find the angle to mock it. Carlo Acutis wasn't weird or extreme. He didn't reject modernity or live like a monk. He was a normal Italian kid who played soccer, had friends, went to school, played video games. He loved Pokemon, played PlayStation, had a dog named Kiara. He was into computer programming and web design, taught himself HTML and graphic design when he was still in elementary school. That stopped me. Computer programming? At that age? That was impressive. I'd started learning to code around 13 or 14, thought I was pretty advanced for my age. This kid was doing it even younger. But here's where it got weird. He used his tech skills for Catholicism. While I was using mine to tear down religion, he'd used his to build it up. The articles explained that Carlo's big project was creating a website cataloging Eucharistic miracles from around the world. Eucharistic miracles, instances where the communion host had supposedly turned into actual flesh and blood, been preserved without decay for centuries, or produced other supernatural phenomena. Catholics believe these miracles prove that the bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood during Mass, not just symbolically, but actually, physically, substantially. I found his website. It was still online, preserved as he'd left it. The design was dated, clearly from the mid-2000s with that early web aesthetic. Basic HTML, simple layouts, web-safe colors, but it was thorough, meticulously documented. He'd cataloged well over 100 Eucharistic miracles, organized by country, each one with historical documentation, photos, scientific analysis when available. Looking at that website, I had to acknowledge something grudgingly. This was real work. Serious work. This kid had put hundreds of hours into this project. He'd researched medieval manuscripts, traveled to churches across Europe, organized all this information into a comprehensive database, and he'd done it all before he was 15 years old. What kind of teenager does that? I told myself I was researching to debunk. I started going through his documented miracles, looking for the flaws, the exaggerations, the obvious explanations. The miracle of Lanciano, where communion bread supposedly turned to actual heart tissue in the 8th century. The miracle of Buenos Aires, where a host developed what looked like human tissue. The incorrupt hosts that had supposedly survived for hundreds of years without decomposition. I assumed it was all either fraud or misinterpretation. Medieval legends with no real evidence. Modern forgeries. Natural phenomena being misunderstood by religious people desperate to believe. I spent hours reading skeptical takes, scientific explanations, debunking websites. But here's what I couldn't get past. Some of these miracles had been investigated by scientists. Real scientists, not just church officials. There were DNA tests, histological analyses, forensic reports. The tissue from the Lanciano miracle had been tested multiple times over the centuries, most recently in 1971, and experts confirmed it was human cardiac tissue with blood type AB, the same blood type found in many of the other Eucharistic miracles across different centuries and countries. Now, I didn't believe these were actually miraculous. There had to be explanations. Contamination, fraud, misinterpretation of data. But I couldn't easily dismiss it the way I could dismiss most religious claims. And more importantly, I couldn't dismiss the work Carlo had put into documenting it all. I bookmarked pages, took screenshots, told myself I'd write a comprehensive takedown of the whole Carlo Acutis phenomenon eventually. But night after night, I kept coming back to it. I'd tell myself I was gathering evidence, but really, I was just reading. I read about his life beyond the website, how his parents weren't particularly religious when he was born. His mother Andrea admitted she only went to church for weddings and funerals before Carlo came along. But from an early age, he was drawn to faith. He insisted on being baptized, asked to receive First Communion early, wanted to go to Mass daily. That detail caught me. His parents didn't force religion on him. He pulled them into it. His mother said he evangelized her, not the other way around. Here was a kid who, in a secular Italian family, chose faith on his own and transformed his family's life in the process. I read about his devotion to the Eucharist. He attended Mass every single day from age 7 until his death at 15. Not because his parents made him, they didn't go daily, but because he wanted to. He'd go before school, often by himself, just to be present at Mass and receive communion. He'd stay after Mass to pray in front of the tabernacle, where the consecrated hosts were kept. He called the Eucharist his highway to heaven. For him, this wasn't ritual or obligation. He genuinely believed that during Mass, bread and wine became the actual body and blood of Christ. He believed that in the tabernacle, Jesus was physically present, waiting, available to anyone who wanted to visit. He believed that receiving communion was literally receiving God into his own body. If that was true, if God actually made himself that available, that accessible, that intimate, it would change everything. I kept reading. Carlo had a deep devotion to Mary, prayed the rosary every day. He loved the saints, studied their lives, asked for their intercession. He was particularly devoted to St. Francis of Assisi. Both were from Italy, both had a radical simplicity about them, both saw God in everything. He had a heart for the poor. He'd befriend homeless people, give them his allowance, bring them food, treat them with dignity. He'd help immigrants in his neighborhood, tutor younger kids who struggled in school, fix elderly people's computers for free. He saw every person as an image of God deserving love and respect. When he was diagnosed with leukemia, he accepted it with grace. He offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, praying that his pain might have spiritual value. He stayed joyful even while dying, concerned more about the spiritual welfare of others than his own physical suffering, and throughout it all, he remained utterly normal. He cracked jokes, played video games, loved his dog, spent time with friends. He wasn't somber or pious in that off-putting way. He was genuinely joyful, genuinely alive, genuinely himself. The more I read, the less I understood how to attack him. See, I was used to religious people being one of two types. Either hypocrites who didn't live what they claimed to believe, or weirdos who were so heavenly minded they were no earthly good. Carlo was neither. He lived his beliefs consistently and radically, but he did it while being completely engaged with normal life. Completely relatable, completely human. I started reading his quotes. The kid had a way with words that was simple but profound. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. We are all born as originals, but many die as photocopies. Not I, but God. Sadness is looking at yourself. Happiness is looking at God. The more Eucharist we receive, the more we will become like Jesus, so that on this earth we will have a foretaste of heaven. I hated that these quotes affected me. I hated that I'd catch myself thinking about them during the day, turning them over in my mind. I hated that when I'd sit down to write my takedown of the Carlo phenomenon, I'd find myself staring at that photo of him smiling, and something in me would hesitate. The thing that got to me most was the technology angle. Here was a kid who loved computers as much as I did, who saw the potential of the internet the way I did, who had the skills I had. But we used our abilities for completely opposite purposes. I was using my tech skills to tear down and destroy, to mock and undermine, to spread doubt and despair. He'd used his to build up and inspire, to document and share, to spread faith and hope. We were both young guys who understood digital culture, both spent hours online, both knew how to reach people through screens. But somehow he'd reached millions with love while still alive and continued to reach them after death. I was reaching dozens with hate, and the only impact I was having was making people more miserable. I started having dreams about him. Not visions or anything mystical. I was still a hardcore materialist. Still didn't believe in anything supernatural. Just regular dreams where he was there, sitting at a computer like me, working on his website. Sometimes he'd look over at me with that smile from the photo. He never spoke in the dreams, just worked and smiled. But his presence was, I don't know how to describe it, peaceful, challenging, like a mirror showing me what I could have been if I'd made different choices. I'd wake up unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that something was shifting inside me. My online activity started to change without me consciously deciding to change it. I'd type out a harsh comment on a Catholic post, then stare at it for a minute and delete it. I'd start to engage in a debate thread, get a few replies in, then just close the tab. I'd see something Catholic-related in my feed, and instead of attacking, I'd just scroll past. My atheist friends noticed. "Dude, what happened to you?" Derek messaged one day. "You haven't posted any takedowns in weeks. You going soft?" "Just busy with work," I replied, which was partially true. But the real truth was that every time I tried to attack someone's faith, I'd think about Carlo Acutis and wonder what he would have done instead. Would he have mocked them, belittled them, made them feel stupid? No. He would have loved them, respected them, engaged with them as human beings made in God's image. But I still didn't believe. That's important to understand. I wasn't converting, not yet. I still thought Catholicism was false, still thought the Eucharist was just bread and wine, still thought prayers were just talking to yourself. But something had shifted in me. The anger was gone. The satisfaction in hurting people was gone. The certainty that I was right and they were stupid, that was crumbling. I felt like I was waking up from a long, exhausting performance. Like I'd been playing a character for years, the smug atheist, the intellectual warrior, the rational skeptic, and the mask was starting to slip. I started actually reading what Catholics believed instead of just reading to refute. I discovered that Catholic theology was way more sophisticated than I'd given it credit for. Aquinas wasn't some medieval fool who believed in magic. He was engaging with Aristotle at the highest levels of philosophy, using rigorous logical frameworks to explore questions about being and goodness and truth. The concept of transubstantiation wasn't magical thinking, it was metaphysics, using philosophical categories of substance and accident to explain how bread could become Christ's body while still looking like bread. The devotion to Mary and the saints wasn't worship or idolatry. It was about the communion of saints, the belief that death doesn't separate us from those who've gone before, that we're all part of one body in Christ. I still didn't believe it, but I couldn't dismiss it as easily anymore. One evening, I was reading about Carlo's devotion to the Eucharist. Catholics believe that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ during Mass. Not symbolically, but actually, substantially, really. Carlo believed this so deeply that he attended Mass every single day, often staying after to pray in front of the tabernacle where the consecrated hosts were kept. For him, this wasn't just a ritual or a tradition. It was encountering the living God, physically present, available to anyone who wanted to come close. I thought about what that would mean if it were true, if God actually made himself available like that, not just as a distant force or abstract concept, but as a physical presence you could visit, could receive, could adore. If the infinite made himself finite and accessible because he loved us that much. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, and the most absurd. I found myself crying at my computer, which hadn't happened in years. I wasn't even sure why I was crying. Grief for the years I'd wasted being angry, longing for something I didn't believe in, fear that maybe I'd been wrong about everything. That's when I did something I never thought I'd do. I prayed. Not really. Not like a believer. I didn't even know if anyone was listening. But I looked at that photo of Carlo on my screen and I said out loud, "Okay, kid, if you're real, if any of this is real, You need to help me, because I don't know what's happening to me." Nothing happened. No lightning bolt, no vision, no voice from heaven. I felt foolish and went to bed. But the next day, something changed. I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew what I needed to do. There was a Catholic church about 2 miles from my apartment. I'd driven past it hundreds of times, never giving it a second thought except occasionally to feel vaguely superior to the people going in and out. I looked up their mass schedule online. They had daily mass at noon. The next day, instead of eating lunch at my desk, I told my coworkers I had an errand to run and drove to St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic Church. My heart was pounding as I pulled into the parking lot. This was enemy territory. This was everything I'd mocked and attacked for years. What was I doing here? I almost turned around 3 times. But something, I still don't know what, pulled me forward. The church was older, built probably in the 1960s, with that modern, angular architecture that hasn't aged particularly well. But inside, it was quiet and surprisingly beautiful. Stained glass windows let in colored light. Statues of saints stood in alcoves. And at the front, above the altar, hung a large crucifix. There were maybe 15 people scattered through the pews for this weekday noon mass. Mostly older folks, a few people in business clothes on their lunch break, one young woman with a baby. I slid into a back pew trying to be invisible. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never been to a Catholic mass in my life. When to stand, when to sit, when to kneel. I just tried to follow what everyone else was doing, always a beat behind. The priest was an older man with white hair and a gentle voice. He read from the Bible, gave a short homily about God's mercy, then began the Eucharistic prayer. I watched him consecrate the bread and wine, speaking the words that Catholics believe transform them into Christ's body and blood. I watched people line up to receive communion, the level of reverence in how they approached, how they received, how they returned to their pews to pray. And I watched the young woman with the baby. She couldn't go up for communion because she was holding the child, but the way she watched, the longing in her eyes, the way she bowed her head when the priest elevated the host, this was someone who believed she was in the presence of God. For the first time in my life, I felt the possibility that it might be true. I didn't receive communion. I knew enough to know you had to be Catholic and in a state of grace, and I was neither. But I stayed after Mass ended, after everyone else had left, sitting in that back pew staring at the tabernacle where the priest had placed the remaining consecrated hosts. If Carlo Acutis was right, God was in there. Actually there. Waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that I was late getting back to work. Long enough that my logical brain exhausted itself trying to find reasons why this was all delusion. Long enough that something deeper than logic started to speak. I went back the next day, and the day after that. For 2 weeks, I went to daily mass at noon, sat in the back, watched, listened, felt. I started reading different books. Not atheist manifestos, but books by converts, people who'd been where I was and found their way to belief. I read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and was shocked by how rigorous and honest his arguments were. I read G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy and laughed out loud at his wit while being convicted by his wisdom. I read Scott Hahn's conversion story and saw echoes of my own journey. And I kept reading about Carlo. I found more stories, more testimonies, more evidence of a life that shouldn't have been possible. A modern teenager living radical holiness without being weird or off-putting, being fully alive while being fully surrendered. I realized that what I'd been doing online wasn't intellectual honesty, it was self-medication. I was so empty inside, so lacking in meaning or purpose, that tearing down other people's meaning gave me a temporary feeling of power. I was so disconnected from any kind of transcendent reality that mocking those who claimed to experience it made me feel less alone in my isolation. But I was alone, profoundly, desperately alone. And I'd been alone for years, surrounded by screens and anger, and the hollow satisfaction of winning arguments. Carlo had lived 15 years and touched millions. I was 27 and had touched no one, not really. I'd left wounds, not gifts. I'd scattered darkness, not light. One day after Mass, I stayed late again, sitting in front of the tabernacle. And this time, I prayed for real. Not testing, not demanding proof, not hedging my bets. I just prayed. God, if you're there, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I've done, everyone I've hurt, all the years I've wasted fighting you. I don't know if I believe yet, but I want to. Please help me believe. Carlo, if you can hear me, please help me find my way home. I opened my eyes and nothing had changed in the church. But everything had changed in me. I met with the priest that week. Father Michael was his name, and he listened to my whole story without judgment. When I told him about my years attacking Catholics online, he didn't condemn me. He just said, "The fact that you're here tells me God never gave up on you. That's how mercy works." He suggested I enter RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, the process through which people become Catholic. I agreed immediately, though I had no idea what I was committing to. The next months were intense in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I had to unlearn years of hostile assumptions and learn to see the faith from the inside. I had to study the Bible not as a text to be dissected, but as God's word to be received. I had to understand the sacraments, not as empty rituals, but as encounters with divine grace. I had to grasp the Church's teachings on everything from the Trinity to sexual ethics, from social justice to the communion of saints. But more than intellectual learning, I had to learn to pray, really pray. The rosary felt awkward at first, repetitive and strange. But my RCIA sponsor taught me to pray it meditatively, to let the repetition quiet my overactive mind and create space for God to speak. It became a lifeline. Eucharistic adoration, sitting in silence before the Blessed Sacrament, became the most profound experience of my week. An hour every Thursday evening, I'd sit in the chapel while the consecrated host was displayed in a monstrance on the altar. Just sitting, just being present with God who was present with me. Those hours changed me more than all the theology books I read. I had to face what I'd done. Father Michael walked me through a thorough examination of conscience, preparing me for my first confession. I had to confront the reality of my sins, not just as mistakes, but as actual offenses against God and His beloved children. Not just the obvious ones like the harassment and mockery, but the deeper ones. Pride that made me think I was better than everyone. Contempt that dehumanized anyone who disagreed. Using my intelligence as a weapon. Finding my identity in tearing others down. Choosing loneliness and bitterness over vulnerability and love. I wrote letters of apology to everyone I could remember attacking online. I found old comment threads, tracked down usernames, searched through archived history. I spent weeks crafting individual messages to dozens of people. Not excusing myself, not explaining, just apologizing. Acknowledging the pain I'd caused, taking full responsibility, asking for forgiveness without expecting it. Most didn't respond, which I understood. Some responded with ongoing anger. I accepted that too. But a few wrote back with forgiveness that shattered me in the best way. Margaret, the Catholic mom blogger I'd tormented, wrote, "Marcus, I've been praying for you for years, ever since you first appeared in my comments. I could see the pain beneath your anger, and I asked Carlo Acutis specifically to intercede for you. Welcome home, brother." I wept reading that, unable to comprehend such grace. Father Tom, the elderly priest whose YouTube videos I'd mocked, sent a brief email. "My son, the prodigal, has returned and heaven rejoices. So do I. If you're ever in Michigan, please visit." The kindness from someone I'd been so cruel to was almost unbearable. The campus ministry group invited me to share my testimony. I flew out to Michigan, stood before 40 young Catholics, and told them everything. How I'd attacked their posts. How Carlo Acutis had saved me from myself. They prayed over me, welcomed me, forgave me. Several said my story had strengthened their own faith, that knowing how far God's mercy could reach gave them hope. I shut down all my old accounts systematically, deleted years of posts, comments, arguments, not to hide what I'd done, but to remove the temptation to go back. It was like cutting off a diseased limb, painful but necessary. My atheist friends thought I'd lost my mind. Derek called me one night, genuinely concerned, using all the arguments we'd perfected together. When he finished, I just said, "I know how this sounds, but I have to follow where truth leads, even when it leads somewhere I never expected." He hung up, and we haven't spoken since. Others cut contact without explanation. I'd been removed from group chats, blocked from social media. It hurt more than I expected. But I'd found a different community, one built on love rather than shared contempt. Easter Vigil was the most beautiful night of my life. After months of preparation, after confession that left me weeping with relief, after renouncing Satan and professing faith in Christ and His church, I was baptized, confirmed, and received my first communion all in one ancient liturgy. The baptismal water felt like drowning and resurrection simultaneously. The confirmation oil marked me as sealed in the Holy Spirit. And then, finally, the Eucharist. When I received the Eucharist for the first time, I understood viscerally what Carlo meant about it being his highway to heaven. It wasn't just a symbol or metaphor, it was encounter. It was love made tangible. It was God humbling himself to become bread so he could be consumed, taken into me, united with me in the most intimate way possible. I knelt after communion with tears streaming down my face, not from emotion alone, but from the sheer reality of what had just happened. I had received Christ. The God who created galaxies had entered into me, body and soul and divinity. Not because I earned it or was worthy, but because he loved me. Pure gift, pure grace, pure mercy. Carlo's intercession had brought me here. That kid who died at 15 had reached across years and miles and the barrier between life and death to pull me out of darkness. My life now looks completely different. I still work in tech, but I've started using my skills for Catholic ministry, building websites for parishes, creating online resources for evangelization, helping make the faith accessible in digital spaces. The same skills I used to tear down, I now use to build up. I've built websites for 3 parishes in the Columbus area, created a database of Eucharistic adoration chapel hours across Ohio, and I'm working on a project to digitize old Catholic documents for university archives. I volunteer at my parish in multiple ways. I teach RCIA classes to other converts, sharing my story and helping them navigate the sometimes confusing process of entering the church. I help with the youth group, using my understanding of internet culture to connect with teenagers who live so much of their lives online. I serve as a lector at Sunday Mass, proclaiming the Word of God from the same lectern where I first heard it proclaimed. I spend an hour in adoration every week, usually Friday afternoons, sitting in silence before the same tabernacle that first drew me into this mystery. I'm learning slowly, stumbling often, but I'm walking toward heaven rather than away from it. I still struggle with pride sometimes, still catch myself being judgmental, still have moments when doubt creeps back in. But now I have tools to deal with these struggles. Prayer, confession, spiritual direction, community. I'm not perfect, not even close, but I'm trying. And in the Catholic understanding, that's what sanctification looks like. Not instant perfection, but gradual transformation through grace. I think about my old self sometimes, that angry young man who found purpose in hurting people, and I feel compassion for him now. He was so lost, so empty, desperately searching for meaning in all the wrong places. He thought he was free, but he was enslaved to his own ego and anger. He thought he was enlightened, but he was blind to the most important realities. He thought he was helping people by attacking their faith, but he was just spreading the misery he felt inside. I've reconnected with a few people from my past. My parents are bewildered by my conversion. They don't understand it, but they're trying to be supportive in their own way. My sister thinks I've joined a cult, but at least she still takes my calls. Some old college friends who weren't part of the militant atheist group have reached out, curious about what happened to me. A few have even asked questions about the faith, and I've been able to share Carlo's story with them. Carlo saw me when I couldn't see myself. He saw past the anger and the mockery to the wounded soul underneath, and somehow, through his prayers, through his example, through the sheer radiance of his brief life, he showed me a different way. He showed me that technology could be a tool for love rather than hate, that intelligence could serve truth rather than pride, that life could have meaning beyond winning arguments and proving yourself right. I have a picture of Blessed Carlo Acutis on my desk now. That same photo that first stopped me mid-tweet, that genuine smile, that normal kid who did extraordinary things. When I'm struggling with pride or tempted to fall back into old patterns, I look at him and remember, we're all called to be saints, even former trolls like me. The Eucharist really is a highway to heaven. Carlo taught me that, and every time I receive communion, every time I kneel before the tabernacle, I thank God for sending a teenage saint to save a 27-year-old fool. I still can't believe I tried to mock him. I can't believe I almost missed this, all of this, because I was so invested in being right. I can't believe how much mercy I've been shown. But that's the thing about God that Carlo understood, and I'm finally learning. The mercy is infinite. No matter how far you've run, how much damage you've done, how convinced you are that you're beyond saving, there's always a way home. And sometimes that way comes through the life of a teenager in a red polo shirt who loved Jesus so much he couldn't help but share that love with everyone he met. Even with people like me, who seemed determined to reject everything he stood for. If you're reading this, if you're skeptical or hostile or convinced that faith is for the weak-minded, I'm not going to argue with you. I spent years perfecting those arguments, and they didn't bring me joy. Instead, I'll just tell you this. Keep your heart open, even a crack, because you never know when grace will slip through. You never know when a story about a dead Italian teenager might completely reorder your life. And if you're already Catholic but struggling, if you've let your faith grow cold or forgotten the beauty of what you have, please learn from my journey. I had to lose everything to find this treasure. You already have it. Don't take it for granted. Go to Mass. Receive the Eucharist. Pray. Let Carlo's example inspire you to use whatever gifts you have, including technology, to share this incredible gift with a world that desperately needs it. Carlo Acutis saw the world through the lens of eternity. He knew his time was short, and he made every moment count. He loved God with his whole heart and showed that love to everyone he encountered. He was joyful, normal, relatable, and completely, radically holy. He saved my life. And I've dedicated what remains of my life to making sure his story reaches as many people as possible, especially people like I used to be. People who think they're too smart for faith, too logical for God, too broken for mercy. Because if Carlo's prayers could reach me, they can reach anyone. Thanks be to God for the life of blessed Carlo Acutis. And thanks be to God for never giving up on lost souls like mine. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to ask for Carlo Acutis' intercession in your own life, whatever you're struggling with. And please, subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because there are more stories of God's mercy waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss them.